In general, for a pagan area, an area that's polytheist, like most of the empire is, the Romans do not really they don't persecute until much later, when they create, under the 3rd century, really. When the Romans show up, there are certain customs they disagree with.
So, at the very beginning of Rome, you mentioned it earlier, Romulus and Remus, the whole succulent, the tail of the wolf.
Yes.
Romulus kills Remus, rest is history. It's a pagan religion.
Yes. So it's Roman polytheism is heavily influenced by the Greeks from the beginning, pretty much. And so they have their own gods, their own names for the gods, who are somewhat different from their Greek counterparts, but they're associated with the Greeks pretty early on. So that the Roman Jupiter is equated to the Greek Zeus. They're not quite the same, but they're similar enough that it works. And so when the Romans expand, to conquer the Greek world, it's okay because their gods are our gods, share and share alike. And there are many other gods all over the empire who are assimilated to the Roman gods, which is kind of fun. So thinking about how the emperors relate to all of this is very interesting. So the emperor is always, from Augustus onward, the Pontifex Maximus, the most important priest in the Roman religion. And it's not like the Pope. They don't have any kind of theological role. They just preside over certain very important sacrifices. They're a priest of Jupiter, the chief god. And the emperor is also the subject of the imperial cult. The emperor is worshipped across the empire. And it's very interesting how this is managed. So in the Greek world, the emperor is a god outright. He is worshipped as a living god. And there's different historical reasons for why this is the case. But in Rome, the emperors won't do that. They can't get away with that because they're still one of the boys. They're one of the aristocrats. And so they're only deified after they die, if they're good emperor, and only by decree of the Senate, which will declare, really kind of posthumously, how good the emperor was by deifying him or not. And so during his lifetime, an emperor is not quite a god, but you can sacrifice on behalf of his genius, his guardian spirit. And so he's kind of this intermediate thing between mortal and God. As the emperors insert themselves into Roman religion, and they're in some ways the unifying factor. Polytheism, Greek or Roman, is not one unitary thing. Every city has its own cults, its own traditions, its own myths. And they're all kind of similar. They're all related to each other. They have the same family resemblance. But they are discrete. And the emperors unite this because wherever you are, you can worship the emperors, past and present, whatever god you might link them to. And so it's kind of an interesting way that the emperors become this integrating factor empire-wide.
Yeah, so it centers around the leadership, essentially. But you also, in the middle of everything around, the turn of, I guess, into before it's 0 AD, so still in the BC times, Rome expands to what is the Holy Land.
Yes,
today.
Under Pompey, they conquer that. So about in the 60s BC.
Okay. Now, this is before the time of Jesus Christ and Christianity. We'll get there. But there are, especially with that area of the world, there's a significant center of the human universe religiously that existed at the time. And you have an enormous Jewish community there, among others. How did it work with the Romans handling the, say, existing religions of places that they conquered? And maybe that's a good example to start with.
Well, actually, the Jews are the worst example because they have only one God. So they're the hardest ones to work with because you can't just slot the emperor in, the Roman gods in. They have one God. And the Romans actually get along quite well with the Jewish leadership. They have a client king, Herod, famously, is most of the aristocracy in Jerusalem is pretty friendly to the Romans. It's not a huge thing until the Jewish revolt, which breaks out, somewhat later than all this. In general, for a pagan area, an area that's polytheist, like most of the empire is, the Romans do not really they don't persecute until much later, when they create, under the 3rd century, really. When the Romans show up, there are certain customs they disagree with. They don't like human sacrifice, for example. They will end that where they find it. So like the Druids in what's now France and Britain do human sacrifice. They put an end to that. But they allow the cults that exist there, the Celtic gods, to continue to be worshipped. What they'll do, though, is they'll introduce the imperial cult. They'll bring in the worship of the emperor, say, okay, you demonstrate your loyalty to us by sacrificing at the altar of the emperors. And kind of organically, the elites of these places will see which way the wind is blowing, and they'll build temples that assimilate their gods to the Roman gods. They're like, okay, well, our god, our god is into commerce. He's kind of like the Roman Mercury, isn't he? And they'll make like a shrine of both Mercury and, some Celtic dude. And so you had this assimilation. They call it the interpretatio Romana, Roman interpretation of religion. So all over the empire you have, even like the Carthaginian gods, so like Baal is assimilated to Saturn, the Roman god Saturn.
Yes.
Or in the same area you'll have like, Astarte or Ishtar becomes Juno. And so it's the same gods they always worshipped, but they have this dimension now that's Roman. And they've kind of been brought into the club. And often customs don't change very much. They'll still worship in the same way they always did, and in the same god they always did. But their god has an additional name now, and that name is Roman.
It's just controllable. It's marketing.
It is, really. And it's as much, actually more, from the local side than from the Roman side. It's these local elites who say, okay, we're going to put ourselves in line with this ruling power. This gives me, as a local aristocrat, more chances to have power within this huge new structure we're part of now. To become, a senator, to become a governor. And so it's really local elites saying, this is our chance to make it big, with the big boys, than it is the Romans saying, you should worship this way. The Romans don't really care how people worship until much later with the Christians.
Right, and it was just it was much harder, though, because the Jews had one God, so they couldn't create these parallels easily.
And even in the case of the Jews, so the Romans are like, okay, this is a very old religion. It's established. We're okay with it. Do your thing.
Really?
Yeah. So they didn't persecute the Jews ever for their religion. There was the Jewish wars.
That's our first.
Right? Yeah. yeah. For once, right? There were wars against the Jews, but that was for political reasons because they rebelled against Roman rule. And there were also, like, Caligula tried to put a statue of himself in the temple in Jerusalem. That was a big deal. So we actually have a record of the delegation sent to Rome to protest this. And it's kind of funny because Caligula is just wandering around the palace talking about landscaping. He's kind of ignoring them, and they're following him around the palace.
Landscaping?
Yeah, he was putting like a new garden in. He was like doing some renovations in the palace.
Nice.
And they're just like following him, trying to talk to him as he's like going around the palace. And then they finally pin him down, and he's like, but I am God. What do you mean?
I'm just picturing a bunch of my angry New York Jewish friends like, God damn it, get this statue out of my synagogue.
Pretty much. It was that. And eventually it was removed. So, it was only later on, under the Christian emperors, that there was persecution of the Jews.
So that's interesting, though. So even at like the height of like a Roman Empire power where they want to make sure they control everything and, their religion goes, this other religion that has a totally different idea is even somehow still able to lobby the emperor himself, and he's just caring enough about his fucking shrubs over there. He's like, all right, knock yourselves out.
Yeah,
take my statue out.
And eventually they won. The statue was not put in. And of course he was assassinated pretty soon after that, which helped too.
And he was an egomaniac though too.
So you could talk to these people. Even if Caligula was insane, he still had to do what an emperor does, which is listen to delegations, which is hear petitioners. Because the emperor's job is not to preside at conferences like a modern president, or declare on the economy. It's to hear petitions. And that's often for people who are very important. But he might try cases at a very humble level. He might hear even, like a local dispute between two villages. It's rare, but it happens.
Well, real quick, because we'll come back to the religion thing. I don't want to lose that. But just as a tangent here, what was the day in the life of an emperor back in that period? Like, obviously they're worried about landscaping sometimes. But is it like today, if you're a judge in court, you get your schedule for the day of what cases you're looking at. Is it very similar where he has like a chief of staff that's like, sir, we have this village coming here today and they're going to talk about this, and then you have to give your blessing on this or sign this decree? Is it very much like that?
It probably varies a lot from emperor to emperor.
Thank you for watching the video, guys. If you haven't already subscribed, please smash that subscribe button and check out this clip's full podcast episode by clicking here